Okay, we get everybody? Fantastic. Well, it is wonderful that you could all join us, and I know that you have a special interest in today's speaker, who will also be a judge in the championship round on Saturday afternoon. And so it's a real pleasure to introduce Dr. Ruth Cromie, a dear friend. I've worked with Ruth on wetland and Ramsar Convention issues for more than a decade. Many of you may know her as the lead author on an article on highly pathogenic avian influenza that appeared in the Journal of International Wildlife Law and Policy. Ruth is a wildlife health specialist, having earned a PhD for vaccine development in wildfowl from University College London. She's worked on various aspects of captive animal and wildlife health throughout the world, including in the UK, the US, and Hong Kong. She's head of the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust's Ecosystem Health, and is responsible for a health program there that includes surveillance, research, advocacy, contingency planning, capacity building, and policy work. She is particularly involved in preparing responses to avian influenza in wild and captive birds, providing surveillance and advice to the UK government, as well as to the Ramsar Convention and its 169 parties. Ruth teaches regularly wildlife health and conservation biology. She's an active member on a UN task force on avian influenza, and is also on the Convention on Migratory Species Preventing Poisons Working Group. She's worked on health resolutions for both the Convention on Migratory Species and also on the Ramsar Convention, and is currently vice chair of the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement Technical Committee. Please welcome Dr. Ruth Cromie.
Well, thank you very much, Roy. It is really lovely to be here. I've got to say thanks to Roy for inviting me to do this. Working with Roy has been a privilege and a joy as well, working for the Ramsar Scientific and Technical Review Panel, and I feel like I've kind of made it, coming to what feels like a film set in this beautiful place with you great folk. Okay, so I want to talk about avian influenza. It'll put you off your lunches, and just sort of see it in a kind of broader context, really. Okay, just to start up with something about the organisation that I work for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. We're UK-based, but we do wetland conservation around the world. In the UK, we have these 10 nature reserves and visitor centres, and we were founded in 1946 by Sir Peter Scott, one of those first visionary conservation biologists. And really what we do, it's about saving wetlands for wildlife and people. And, you know, why wetlands? Well, wetlands really are those habitats which are absolutely fundamental for life on Earth. And in terms of health, you really can see wetlands as an absolute source of health, because they are our providers of clean water, of food, of resources, providing livelihoods, recreational opportunities, as well as psychological well-being as well. Just to say something about the small team of ecosystem healthers at WWT, there they are, all looking nice and smiley. They're not so smiley at the moment because this trip coincides with us having to move offices. So I've left them all moving my office that I've been in for 20 years. Not so smiley now. Okay, so we do a range of work, working also there with the vets who deal with the zoological collections that we hold as well. And what we are trying to do in our little unit is promote those sort of solutions for promoting health in wetlands. And you're going to see an awful lot of Venn diagrams in this presentation, but everything we do really revolves around this idea that health is very connected. We start with wildlife, but it's related to domestic animals and to human health as well. And so the sorts of things we do then, we do the health aspects of our conservation translocations, our reintroduction project. So we have to make sure that the birds that we are releasing are good and healthy. These are little cranes, for example, and we need to make sure that they are healthy so that then when they are released, they're in the best possible condition to survive, but they're also not providing a health risk to livestock and people and so on as well. And we do lots of translocation projects with this critically endangered wading bird, for example, the spoonbill sandpiper, which I mention just as an excuse to show you that cute photograph of a baby spoonbill sandpiper. And we do lots of wildlife disease surveillance. So sometimes it's in birds, sometimes it may be in other wetland animals, such as amphibians, looking for key emerging threats, such as chytrid fungus. And tackling key issues, things like illegal hunting. So, for example, we know that when we catch Buick swans in the winter, which are protected throughout their flyway, about a third of them carry shot that's actually embedded in them. They've been shot at, so we know they're protected. So we have a project then looking at illegal hunting, trying to understand the motivations for illegal hunting. And I think it says a lot about those of us in the unit. We've all kind of begun as natural scientists, but we're having to move much more into social science, really, to understand why people do things and how you then tackle that. I spend about 600 hours a week, it would seem, working on lead poisoning from ammunition sources and trying to work with the hunting community to get them to use non-toxic ammunition. So just to comment about a lot in the hunting community, they always seem to be much taller than me, and they have guns as well. So trying to persuade the hunting community to change something very traditional is very complicated. As I say, I started in biology, and I just wanted to sort of comment about, whilst you can persuade as much as you like, if you don't have regulations to change this sort of behaviour, it just doesn't work. So it's about carrots and sticks, and so I am indebted to you lawyers out there for then working up these kind of regulations that actually then properly bring about change. And when I've worked with environmental lawyers, you know, your ability to wordsmith, to understand language, to think on your feet, you know, well done, you bright young things out there. I'm very impressed with you. Another area of work that we're doing a lot on at the moment is looking at wetlands and how they relate to our human health and well-being. So we're doing a lot of sort of evidence gathering on the psychological, physiological and cognitive evidence that you need really to illustrate how wetlands are very important for our human health. So that's a big area of work we're getting into at the moment. But back to then avian influenza. This is what we'll be talking about in this lecture. And I want to talk particularly about H5N1, which is really an unprecedented health issue. And we'll keep coming back to this particular picture. I'm going to mention early on zoonoses and zoonotic infections, etc. So just to get a definition up front, here is my colleague Richard demonstrating risks from a marmoset. A zoonosis is an infection that readily transmits then, or can transmit between a vertebrate animal and a human, can go in both directions, okay? So there's our definition up front. And H5N1, what is unusual about it is that it has this zoonotic risk and has then the potential for creating a pandemic. We'll come back to that later on. But H5N1 then really is this risk across these different sectors of wildlife, livestock and human health. In terms of impacts on the poultry industry, we have seen billions of birds either killed by the disease or in those disease control programs, and then billions of dollars then spent on that as well, so huge economic impact. And at its worst, H5N1 absolutely covered huge chunks of the old world. So I'm united from all of us in the old world that we, all the countries I heard being mentioned from the old world, I thought, yes, well done, you've had H5N1 as well. So we are united by this particular virus. In terms of human health impact, the numbers of cases are relatively small given how long this virus has been out there. But what is very important is that mortality rate. That's still a high mortality rate for this virus. So it's a dangerous human pathogen if humans do become infected with it. And the countries which have had the greatest impacts in terms of human deaths have been in Egypt, in Indonesia, and in Vietnam. But it's not just how do I make that? Oh, that's a bit of video. Anyway, that was a video of a sixth one, it would have put you off your lunch, so maybe we'll move on from that. What I wanted to do was to try to get over how we are in something of an influenza crisis at the moment. I was trying to find a graphic that could show that well, and the best I could come up with was this. And this is, the orange dots here are influenza outbreaks or pandemics, and if you can see, they're becoming much, much more common. And so I think we're really living in a sort of influenza sort of crisis time. And so I want us to reflect really on how we have managed to get here to this sort of influenza crisis time. But before doing that, then let's kind of look back at where we've come from and sort of reflect on global health patterns. And in many ways, in sort of the developed countries, we've kind of overcome a lot of our infectious diseases, and mainly by better housing, better diets, vaccination and antibiotics. And you can see this decline. This is infectious disease deaths in the US. You can see how these have declined over time. And in many ways, we have replaced these old infectious diseases with a whole new raft of kind of non-infectious diseases. The heart disease, cancers, type 2 diabetes, respiratory diseases, and mental health issues. And these are related to, diet, lack of exercise, tobacco and alcohol and drugs, poor air quality, and also a lot of these things that create for us psychological problems, and this sort of nature disconnection, this too much time on our screens, and also in an aging population, much more loneliness than we used to see, etc. So we have this whole new raft of health challenges, quite different to what we might have seen 100 years ago. But, and even as we become a much more urban species, we can see that these kind of diseases will just become, more and more of a problem. But to now concentrate on those infectious diseases, although we've kind of got rid of some of the old infectious diseases, many of the infectious diseases remain a persistent problem around lots of the world, things like tuberculosis and so on. Really what we've got is a whole new world of these new emerging infectious diseases. Okay, so it's kind of out with the old and in with the new. And why do we have these emerging diseases? Well, it's usually a product of novel or changed conditions. A host and a parasite tend to come to some kind of equilibrium over time, but where you've got something changed, then this is where you get an emergence of a disease problem. And it might be old pathogens that have now found themselves into new hosts. And if we look at this increase in emerging infectious diseases, this blob actually from the 1980s was the emergence of HIV, and then lots of immunosuppressed people then getting the old pathogens that were around then becoming infected with those. But this trend is on the way up because of old pathogens and new hosts, but also new pathogens in the existing hosts. And if you imagine why this is happening, this is really because of the enormous amount of environmental change that we are creating on the planet. So whether that is habitat destruction, climate change, forcing people together in highly urbanized areas, or some of our sort of crazy food production systems, then you can see how this forces all of these sort of different emerging infectious diseases. And then, of course, we can whisk those around the world very, very quickly because of how we travel around so much. And so this slide just illustrates how some of these human activities create then this sort of emergence of all these new diseases. So a really important concept is this absolute connectivity between the health. I mean, we just share so many diseases across the piece, okay? So we can't look at disease, in separate silos. And if you look at where these emerging infectious diseases are coming from, most of them are they're zoonotic from wildlife. If you look at these white bits are getting bigger over time. So our new diseases in humans are coming from wildlife. And perhaps it's not so surprising when you think about how we are moving into wildlife areas, how we are manipulating wildlife and so on. And this spilling of wildlife diseases into people, we see it quite regularly. High profile cases then would be in spillover of Ebola viruses, probably circulating in bats, which sometimes may spill then into primates and duikers and so on, which may then spill into people, and then we see these outbreaks. But if I can concentrate a little bit on our food production systems, and this is a global problem, this isn't finger pointing at anyone. I think we all have this challenge of trying to feed the world, but some of our ways, particularly producing animal protein, really have created lots of problems for us. And you can see that a lot of this is not sustainable. I mean, in the UK, we had the great idea of feeding dead sheep with a disease and dead cows with a disease back to cows, which are herbivores, you know, and not surprisingly, then, you know, the disease, we've got, you know, great animal production, but the fly in the ointment is then a disease of mad cow disease. And if we look at poultry production, certainly poultry overtook fish some years ago as the #1 protein source that we humans eat. And I think a lot of our poultry production then is unfortunately really contributing then to our avian influenza crisis that we're in. So we're now going to go to avian influenza viruses 101, so keep up with this. All these H5s and H7s and all this sort of business, it's all based on taxonomy of these surface proteins. So you can have all these different H's and different N's all reassorting and, you know, recombining with each other. They're highly variable viruses, they mutate a lot, and they like to reassort different bits from different viruses. And really importantly, in this story of H5N1 and these influenza viruses, we need to get our head around the difference between these low pathogenic viruses and these high pathogenic viruses, because the high pathogenic viruses are novel in the wild bird situation. That is not a typical situation to have high pathogenic viruses in wild birds. So they're classified differently. These low pathogenic viruses, they're adapted to water. They are evolved to be pooed out of an infected bird and eaten by another bird. And then what we see is a sort of a natural reservoir of low pathogenic viruses in all these migratory waders and waterfowl. So that's a natural reservoir. They've always been there. They're just part of a natural ecology. The problem is that the H5s and H7s, in a poultry setting where birds are all packed together, those natural mutations can then switch this low pathogenic virus into a high pathogenic virus, and this is when you then get poultry outbreaks. And these H5s and H7s are then notifiable. Your country then has to tell the World Animal Health Organization that you have this disease, and then that results in trade restrictions and so on. It has economic impact. And of course, these viruses can have a zoonotic potential as well. So just to look at H5N1, it was a virus which emerged in China now more than 20 years ago in domestic poultry, in domestic geese. And then we saw cases in Hong Kong shortly after that, but it was controlled in Hong Kong. And it sort of disappeared, really, until about 2003. And then it re-emerged, and since then, we've seen it then all over the world. I want to talk about some of our food production systems, and I think, you know, why did this virus really take off? I think one of the key things about shifting this virus from a poultry setting into a wild bird setting, I think, was the practice of wild bird farming. So we have these challenges of getting enough protein for people, and so in these wild bird farms here, these are my colleague, the same colleague, Richard, who was feeding food to his marmoset. He works a lot in China on bird monitoring. But you can see where wild birds have then been gathered in various ways and then farmed like this, all of their natural viruses, you know, packed together. You can see then how it's potential for these birds then to escape if they've been in there with chickens, etc. You can see how H5N1 could then get from these wild bird farms with birds sometimes going out into rice paddies for feeding, sometimes escaping. And I think it's this which has helped sort of concentrate or get H5N1 into wild bird populations. And really the big game changer was in the spring of 2005, where this virus then spilled in a really big way at Lake Qinghai in China. And these high pathogenic viruses, we just didn't really see them in wild birds before, but this killed about 6,000 birds at this big outbreak. It was something of a game changer. And really what we saw here was that the genie was out of the bottle. These typically poultry viruses were suddenly out in wild bird populations in a big way. And what is thought is that survivors from that outbreak at Lake Qinghai then, as they flew north for breeding, they were staging at Lake Qinghai, probably then took virus up into Mongolia and into parts of Central Asia. And then, because of migratory bird routes as well as poultry movements, then probably this is how we saw then this pattern of spread across the old world. And at its peak then, there in sort of 2006, you could see then how these Asian viruses have moved all the way across, and actually even to sort of West and East Africa as well. Certainly, I remember that winter of 2005, 2006 in Europe very well. The idea was that survivors of an outbreak up here in Russia, then during their winter migration, those birds then brought infection around the Caspian and around the Black Sea. Because it was such a cold winter and a lot of the Black Sea then was frozen, birds which ordinarily would never come so far west were then pushed much further west, and we saw then outbreaks all across Europe in that first winter of H5N1. But I must stress, wild birds are a tiny bit of this story. They're one bit, but the big thing really is in poultry trade, local trade, either in poultry parts or in live birds, and then international poultry trade as well. And certainly in the UK, we've had incursion of H5N1 in poultry products coming in. And in many ways, I would say that chickens are more migratory than migratory birds are, so we have to understand those kind of trade routes. And then there's the pet wild bird trade. Billy Koresh and his crew reckoned that there was something like 350 million live animal movements per year, of which probably about a quarter are illegal or not controlled, so there's no veterinary surveillance going on there. And we know that this virus has been able to move around in imported birds and in pet bird trade. Certainly our first case in the UK was in legally imported birds. Worth saying to you lawyers, because the birds were in quarantine, they weren't legally within the UK, so we managed to not find ourselves with any sort of movement restrictions and so on. But a lot of these movements might be illegal. For example, here's some hawk eagles shipped from Thailand to Brussels, smuggled in with H5N1. And that's an excuse to show a man with some pigeons in his trousers. So, bird movements happen, all over the world. And just to illustrate, we do move birds around the world in bizarre ways, don't we? So, hawks on a plane, okay. But it's not just in birds, it might actually just even be on our feet, on our wheels of our feed lorries and so on. So lots of ways that viruses can be moved about. Okay, to go back then to look at some of these impacts then of H5N1. In terms of humans, okay, the greatest, their loss of life, loss of human life and morbidity, affecting livelihoods. Because these are notifiable diseases, you then have to, get involved in sort of culling of poultry, etc., which affects economies, it can affect your national economy, it can affect food security, and certainly for a virus like H5N1 with its zoonotic potential, there's always this possibility for it becoming a pandemic strain, a human pandemic strain, due to a mutation or a recombination. But for wild birds, certainly at first with H5N1, we saw these incredibly high mortality figures of thousands of birds dying at any one go. This was a new virus. It was new. That relationship between the host and pathogen was new, and there was very, very high mortality. And if you think, about these viruses, they love recombining with a bit of this and a bit of that. So, thinking about how those viruses combine, I just want to sort of reflect on another food production system then, which brings all sorts of risks. So these are terrible photographs of one of the most beautiful places I've been in the world. This is in Bangladesh at Tangwa Hawa, which is this spectacular, huge wetland site, incredibly important for wintering water birds. And the birds there are at incredibly high densities. It's really, my photography is terrible. So behind these guys who are fishing, you can see, you know, densely packed water birds. So I want you to imagine that all of those viruses that those birds have got, they're all being reassorted, etc., within those flocks out there. But then you add on top of that the practice, which is becoming more and more prevalent as our needs to feed the world and our demand for meat is going up and up. More and more flocks of domestic ducks being taken out into these wild areas. So wild birds with all their viruses and domestic birds with all their viruses then being taken in amongst all the wild birds. So it's like the perfect situation to create an avian virological nightmare, actually, because then these domestic birds brought home at night, held overnight, all packed together. You know, if you're interested in viruses, you can. This is it's a great way of generating viral problems, and then these birds taken to market, and so people are then at risk as well. So natural settings now intimately linked to food production systems and so on. And so you can really see the potential there. And these, are new. It's happening more and more. So this is the changed shape of why we are then getting more and more avian influenza outbreaks. And because these viruses love to reassort, then this is why we're now seeing not just H5N1, but out there in wild birds, we've got H5N8, N6, N2. These are viruses that like to change. The genie is out of the bottle, and they're now, for the first time, in the last 20 years, they're out. These high pathogenic viruses are out in wild birds. So we saw high mortality, and mortality is certainly one of the impacts for wild birds, but also we had mortality in threatened species like red-breasted geese, and actually 10% of the world's population of bar-headed geese died during that first outbreak. So we've got birds here who are both victims and vectors. But I think it's wider than that, and probably the indirect impacts have had the biggest impact on conservation. So habitat and nest destruction, research suspended or stopped, fewer ringing recoveries, people are afraid of birds, release of non-native birds as people became sort of paranoid about keeping birds, and a public fear and paranoia. And here is an example of pouring disinfectants into a wetland, which we will be exploring this as part of the competition. But habitat destruction because of this virus. And what's been unfortunate is that because wild bird flyways cover the whole world, it's been really easy to blame wild birds before you know anything at all about how that virus got there. And I would say, why do we blame wild birds so very readily? Well, they can't sue, can they? You're kind of off the hook, aren't you? It wasn't your biosecurity, it was, some flipping wild bird came in and pooed it into your poultry instead. So it's been sort of over-egged, the whole wild bird story. But of course, creating or blaming wildlife, it creates this sort of antipathy and has negative conservation consequences. I mean, I work for an organisation that is just hell-bent on getting people to love ducks and geese and swans. And if you love something, you are much more likely to want to save it. You're going to care for it. Look at the terrible impact that Jaws had on shark conservation. This is our equivalent of Jaws to have these viruses in our lovely birds. And our lovely British media, God bless their souls, how they love a story like, a great montage there of ducks of death, very responsible reporting. And I just remember the morning of seeing, a moderately responsible newspaper had on the front of it every photograph of every bird I've ever loved, but, in a negative story, just heartbreaking, really. And there's a local newspaper to our centre at Slimbridge, invasion of the bird flu, just not helping conservation at all. And kind of worse than that, I think that H5N1 had loads of really poor science associated with it. Some terrible satellite tracking projects that just killed birds. It didn't tell you anything. It just told you that if you stick a kilogram onto a duck and ask it to fly off, it will die. And we had lots of missed opportunities. And certainly in the early days of H5N1, I would say that we were looking at, one world and 3 separate healths. And the beginning of this crisis was just not helped by this sort of philosophy. However, it would be too miserable to just be grumpy. I think that H5N1 really has actually provided for us a lot of opportunities and a lot of really quite positive outcomes in some ways, both to conservation and the health sector. I think because it has been a problem that's affected all sectors, we've ended up having to have much better cooperation and much more integrated approaches and responses. So, particularly for things like surveillance, because we're dealing with flyway scale problems, we've had regional approaches to doing surveillance, more money for doing that. Governments working much more closely with ornithologists. I think in the UK, our government could not believe how much ornithological knowledge there was in the country. I think they were delighted to sort of find that. So anyway, we had then ornithological expert panels that could advise government when we had outbreaks on where there might be risks. In an outbreak of swans, we could advise the government that if you put control measures in that are that shape, based on what we know about where those birds go, then that will, that can be the restrictions for your, or the areas for your movement restrictions, and it worked well. And, okay, for example, our government, they know where the chickens are, we have a poultry register. If you lay that on top with water bird densities, we know that, then we could come up with kind of high-risk areas. So there's sort of, integrating data sets which just hadn't been integrated before, different disciplines working together. And it brought together, I think importantly, the UN Convention on Migratory Species and the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. And these two bodies had not really worked together before, but H5N1 was that catalyst. And for example, then, they set up the Scientific Task Force on Avian Influenza and Wild Birds, and we could get out information at the time in different languages, etc., producing situation updates and so on, and trying to just make those balanced. Lots of information came out. It really got the FAO much more engaged in wildlife health, which I think is really important. And in terms of surveillance, it liberated this money for doing surveillance, which could be for avian influenza, but it could be for other diseases, or we could piggyback on that and actually just do surveillance and water bird monitoring, etc., using this bird flu money. So there's my mate Richard again. I don't know why he's in so many of my slides, but he is. And we have been blessed then to be able to go and do surveillance in all sorts of great places around the world. So there we are back in Bangladesh and doing, surveillance by day and night. I have to say, this was the maddest surveillance I've ever done in a dugout boat in the middle of that massive lake late at night. We did reflect that it wasn't really on our risk assessment, some of the nutty stuff that we ended up doing on that particular trip. But then also kind of building capacity then for these guys as well to do more health work. H5N1 has liberated money for good science, and we've had some really good migration studies done by some experienced people. We know lots more about wild bird movements and other tools for mapping migration, etc., and lots of capacity building. So it's given us the money to build capacity for doing surveillance, but as I say, you can be training people in trapping birds, for ringing studies, for those, those basic monitoring things that we all need for conservation. This was a 3-week project that we had in Nigeria, training folk from about half a dozen different countries. And I suppose what was so good is, it's identifying those key individuals that soak up knowledge so much. So this is Esmet from Sudan, who you could see was very, very sharp, absolutely got it, one of the great ornithological sort of skills of his country, making the most of this training. And something that was particularly satisfying about having the money to do this was bringing together the different ornithological skills from different countries. So Amakobi here and Wamiti here are 2 Kenyan ornithologists. So Kenya has got a great reputation for ornithology, and being able to link them then to their Nigerian counterparts and keep that relationship up, I think, is one of the great outcomes of H5N1. And of course, we're going to need those sort of bodies that type of surveillance, etc., when you think about all the future needs that we've got, all of these other diseases that are out there. And given that these diseases are on the up, we need all of that capacity that we can. The multilateral environmental agreements, I think, were good. They really picked up on this as an emerging issue and knew that we had to then, get that into some of these resolutions. So I won't say very much about it because you guys will be poring over these words, but I'm delighted that somebody is actually reading the words that we wrote. Well done, guys, for those of you in the competition. So, a great moment actually to get some of these resolutions, adopted at some of these COPs and MOPs. I think it's really put wildlife disease absolutely on the agenda for conservation. It was always seen as something a little bit, on the outside. It was something for vets, but I think it's really made us, in the conservation world, see that disease is important. And it's given us the mandate for doing further disease guidance. So at this COP in Korea in 2008, it gave us the mandate to then start producing guidance for far more of these wetland diseases. And I think, if you do your problem analysis from these wetland diseases, and you track back, it's really important then that the guidance has to be about some of these issues here, not just how to treat with antibiotics, but how to make the right decisions early on. That's the sort of key bit. Because certainly when we're dealing with wetlands, I was banging on about them being, a source of great health, but if you mismanage your wetlands, they can be a source of pathogens, disease vectors, toxins, physical hazards, and psychological ill health. If you're pushing systems beyond that ecological resilience, then you're sort of pushing from a healthy situation into a more sort of diseased situation. And that is such a problem with our thinking about health at the moment, is that we think about health as, something for vets and medics, and we think about it down at this end. We manage the system poorly, we kind of create a problem, we get better at spending money, on the surveillance of the detecting, and then that responding and treating, this is where so much of our thinking goes. And I really think that it is up here, it's getting, people making the right laws to manage the system properly. That stops us having to, spend all that money downstream. Basically, clean water is, a more cost-effective way than having to treat the problems caused by, poor quality water. So seeing then that health is actually in the hands of the sort of managers and the policy makers, so, a big piece of the guidance that we have produced in our little unit is this Ramsar Wetland Disease Manual, and that provides practical guidance, but also the principles of how to manage your systems in a healthy way. And it's got lots of fact sheets and case studies and sort of principles of this and practices as well. We think it's lovely. Perhaps you will too. That's quite a sexy thing. And we are generating at the moment a thing called wetlandhealth.org, which will have the manual at the moment, it's on the internet, but we want a health portal, so we're just working up this wetlandhealth.org at the moment. Coming soon. How exciting. Okay. So to finish up my whistle-stop tour there, I think global health patterns have really shifted significantly. And these emerging diseases are a sort of product of novel systems or novel conditions which are pushing ecosystems beyond a natural resilience. And in many ways, H5N1 or these highly pathogenic viruses, they are diseases of our own making. And they are continuing to present many threats, but also we have to capitalise on the opportunities that they've provided, because we'll have so many more disease risks in the future. And taking this ecosystem approach, this kind of working upstream approach, which involves, as I say, so much about your sort of regulatory process and things that you guys deal with a lot, really, I think, presents the best solution for a healthy future. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for that incredibly informative and sobering presentation. And what I'd like to do now is open it up for questions. And if you could just identify yourself, please, before you ask the question.
Thank you. Keith Long, and Dr. Ruth is a very thought-provoking program and presentation. I thank you for that. The Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust seems to have the strategic survey and surveillance leg of this problem at hand. Are you going to invest, or do you have any involvement in developing vaccines?
Vaccines. Do you know, I did my PhD on vaccine development back in the 18th century, and what was interesting about the vaccine that I was working on at the time, I thought, oh yeah, this is useful, but I really could see quite early on, which is a mistake in your PhD, if if you want to be developing a vaccine, I thought, do you know what, we are putting a sticking plaster on this because the problem, which was avian tuberculosis, was about management rather than the development of a vaccine. So actually we don't have any plans for any other vaccine development. It's a very expensive thing to do and so on. And I would argue that very often by the time we're having to use wildlife vaccines, we've been messing up a system higher up, and usually there's a management way to reduce your need for having to then resort to sort of veterinary interventions like that. There have been some cases where you have to have vaccines for Ethiopian wolves or lions or whatever, but or hunting dogs, etc. But I really think that it's not so much the approach we're taking, and we can't afford a lot of it.
My name is Leah Kanyangi, and you've mentioned that one of the approaches you've taken is to try to change the mentality or the perception of the people around the wetlands on the wild water birds. So how successful has that been in just trying them to get them to understand the cause of this disease?
Well, it's a really good question because I think it's really difficult to be saying to somebody, oh, you need to not do that because that's going to affect wildlife health. So if you could not feed your family this evening, that would be great. And actually, I suppose we haven't worked so much on the community engagement for some of that avian influenza control, and that's been done a bit more by the UN FAO and other organisations other than us. So we have concentrated more on the sort of conservation aspects, but it's a great question. It's not so much what we do, but it is more what other organisations do of then at least informing people of the risks, and ideally, in fact, the Ramsar Wetland Disease Manual talks about some sort of basic kind of biosecurity things that you can do. And so much of these risks actually then can be mitigated in terms of human health risks just by, simple hygiene precautions, etc. But that really is just one part of it, because actually, of course, what we want to see are some shifts in how we do our food production. But that, it's a massive challenge. I don't have all the answers to it either, so that's not very satisfactory, is it?
Hello, my name is Pranav Ganesan, and I come from Bhopal. My question is, with respect to the impacts that your projects have had on cultural rights movements. Now, we know that there are a lot of people who have like cultural rights with respect to land and wetland use, right? Now, the question is, there's obviously a direct clash between some of the activities that the FAO is undertaking and the cultural rights of these individuals.
Yeah.
How is it that the FAO is trying to arrive at a balance between these two sides? And can it be said that the trend in the present day is that the environment is being preferred over the cultural rights of and interests of people?
These are very, very clever questions, aren't they? Okay, so I suppose, I can't speak on behalf of the FAO. I suppose what is interesting to see is that there's a lot of the food production, for example, the grazing ducks there in Bangladesh, the guys who are grazing those ducks, they're not the people who are then making the money out of selling that meat. So these are new ventures where just the locals, with the rights that they have, they are now taking on different jobs. It's not where they began. It's not how they would ordinarily be farming, etc. So it's now big business is then paying, small money to those, young guys who are out there sort of grazing their ducks. So whilst we have all those, rights going on, we've then got, novel systems coming in which aren't necessarily providing health to those people. They're providing health risks instead. So it's a complicated balance. I've got to say, I don't work day to day in food production, and the FAO and other organisations will be much more on the ground and know about those things. So it's not answering your question very well, but I think if you can sell to people the idea that they have some ownership, the community has ownership on their own health, that I think if you can get the community to understand that they need to participate in making those decisions about their health, so they know, the communities know they need to feed themselves, but they want to do that safely. So I think if that community involvement, if that, they can be aware of the risks that they are being put at, possibly by big business requesting, particular new practices and so on, then I think, more community engagement, being fully informed of those risks, etc. I think that probably helps balance some of those issues a bit better.
Thank you very much. Richard Walsgrove from the University of Hawaii. First, a quick comment and then a question. I was delighted to see your slide that's saying that one of the problems is birds can't sue. That's obviously a persistent problem in wildlife conservation. I can tell you happily, Hawaii is home to at least one case in which a bird was given standing to sue in its own name. So
cool. Yeah.
we have a few other examples like that. My question, and perhaps there is no answer to it, and I think that's fine, but my question is there a gold standard or a bright spot to demonstrate to us where we've had poor ecological management improve, and we can see directly that improvement in health metrics, human health metrics? In other words, is there somewhere where that's already been proven out that we can point to as this is why we need to do this on a more widespread basis?
Now, it's a really good question. So we're really looking for good case studies where this has happened well, and it's interesting because those are just exactly the kind of case studies we're looking for to put in our wetlandhealth.org. And we actually, funnily enough, we have struggled a bit. And probably there are good examples, small scale, small scale. So we manage 10 wetlands in the UK. We manage those against health problems. We're not eating the birds that come from those nature reserves, obviously, because they're nature reserves. So, but what we can really see is the benefits of managing those against some of the diseases that we used to have. Because what is difficult to excite people about is the absence of a problem. So sometimes you don't notice the absence of a problem. You notice the problem, don't you? So in terms of big scale, I can't actually off the top of my head give you some good examples, but it's exactly what we want to be promoting through wetlandhealth.org, for a wetland setting.
So a number of the questions sort of focused on communicating and working with local communities. We sort of move to a higher scale and talk a little bit about your work with different multilateral environmental agreements. What did you find to be most challenging or surprising when you were drafting and working with contracting parties to get these resolutions adopted?
I think, as usual, is that most countries have got big poultry sectors, and they are very important economically, they're feeding the country, etc. And so countries were very reluctant to take on board anything that might be in any way damaging to the poultry sector. And I think that systems thinking approach of understanding that actually if you do the right thing with the water birds, ultimately you do the right thing for the poultry, I think that was lacking. And it was in 2012 that we had a resolution on ecosystem approaches to health in wetlands, and certainly Pierre Horvitz, who was one of the main leads on coming up with that resolution, we reflected a lot on how that resolution got adopted, but we weren't absolutely convinced that contracting parties really understood that we think there is still a sort of an ignorance of this idea of health and how everything's connected, and it happens upstream by involving communities, involving your decision makers about in every single ministry in government. If they were all thinking about health, they would make good decisions. You know, if that was in transport, there'd be much more active transport. If it was in housing, there'd be better housing, you know. And I think if people could think with health as their sort of framing concept, you wouldn't come up against this sort of idea of, oh no, it's bad for the chicken industry, because you think this isn't bad for the chicken industry, this is just making sure it's also good for wildlife. So I think that there's still not enough understanding at a sort of government level, really, about this kind of systems thinking that we need about health.
And then I have just one last question. So
You're hogging the microphone.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
You had talked about the importance of a cross-disciplinary approach to dealing with these challenges. What advice do you have for the law students in the room for when they work with environmental scientists, or what characteristics have you found to be most beneficial with the environmental attorneys who you've worked with?
Do you know what I always say to any students that I ever teach, the conservation students that I ever teach, sounds a bit glib. Could you be a nice person? Could you be somebody who can work really easily with people at all levels? You know, keep your mind open. I'm sure you're all lovely people anyway, but you have to be somebody who can work at all levels with all sorts. So I work, you know, I come from a science background, and I work with some scientists who are so in their ivory towers, it's a bit tricky for them to communicate with the rest of the world. You know, we have to have a sort of basic understanding of how you legal folk, you people who will understand that, you know, how all of these different disciplines kind of overlap. And it happens well when you're a nice person who can be open-minded, who can challenge, but who doesn't, you know, mind being challenged. So, I mean, you know, to say be nice sounds a bit stupid, doesn't it? But I think to understand the problem well as well, we've got a new government affairs guy, and he's so charming and so lovely. Politicians like talking to him, you know, our MPs, you know, because he will be wise, he won't put his ego in the way, and he will come and he will soak up the issue from us who've got the issue and know how to then interpret it well. And he's good at letting us know kind of how we should tell the story better, because we scientists think if we give you more facts, that'll, you know, convince anyone, and that's not the case, is it? So you people who understand the law and how that works, and people as well, you need to keep reminding us, you know, how to interpret what we need, you know, and to actually sort of put it into action.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Please join me in
Okay.
thanking Ruth once again.